Hi, everyone, and welcome to my show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. I am your host, John Gold, and this show is part of the Soapbox People's Network. This week, we're going to speak with someone who disagrees with the so-called 9/11 truth movement. Hi, this is John, and I'm here with Jonathan Kay. How are you doing today, Jonathan?
Good, thanks.
Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to read your bio. Jonathan Kay is a Canadian journalist. He is the editor-in-chief of the Walrus and former Comment Pages editor, columnist, and blogger for the Toronto-based Canadian daily newspaper National Post. He is also a book author and editor, a public speaker, and a regular contributor to Commentary Magazine and the New York Post. His freelance articles have been published in a variety of U.S. publications, including Newsweek, The New Yorker, Salon.com, The New Republic, Harper's Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, the Weekly Standard, the Literary Review of Canada, the National Interest, and the New York Times. Books he has written are The Volunteer, A Canadian Secret Life in the Mossad, which was co-written by Michael Ross, and Among the Truthers. Alrighty, so that is your bio, and you ready to get into the questions?
Sure, although I can't promise I will be as informed as some of your other guests on some of the most recent developments. As I mentioned in our correspondence, I haven't kept up with the latest developments since I wrote my last book. So I'm happy to proceed as long as you're okay with me occasionally just saying things like, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting that you say that you haven't followed it, but I saw that in March of 2014 you had written an article specifically about architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Yeah, that was about the head of AE 9/11, Richard Gage, when he came to Toronto. I mean, that was interesting for me to see because I'd interviewed Richard Gage for my book, and I'd seen him speak a couple of times. So I did have a special interest in going to see his presentation, just to get a sense of how the 9/11 truth movement had developed since I researched and wrote my book.
All right, so let's get to the questions. What was the day of 9/11 like for you?
For me, I was up in Toronto, and I started like any other work day. I was working at the National Post newspaper. I have a specific memory of reading a news alert saying that a small private plane had flown into the World Trade Center. And this is not an unprecedented thing. It's sometimes you get amateur pilots flying their planes into buildings accidentally, which is what I assumed it was at the time. And then I turned on TV a little while later, and of course I saw the horrible footage that everybody else was seeing on that day, and started learning about what happened.
What, if anything, did you question about the 9/11 attacks?
I guess I was too shocked by what happened to start questioning anything. I guess I knew immediately that there was some terroristic motive because of if one plane had flown into a building, that could be just some kind of crazy mechanical problem, but two planes that, like everybody else, I suspected it was a terrorist attack, and so I wasn't surprised when very quickly we learned about the identity of the hijackers and their affiliations.
As the person who coined the phrase 9/11 truther, I defined it by saying that, quote, in my mind, a 9/11 truther is someone who fights alongside the family members seeking truth and accountability for the 9/11 attacks. In my mind, a 9/11 truther is someone who fights for the sick and dying 9/11 first responders who need health care desperately. In my mind, a 9/11 truther is someone who does not like how the day of 9/11 is being used to inflict pain and suffering around the world and is trying to stop it. Stop it by using the truth, something we have been denied by our government regarding the 9/11 attacks. Because of how the phrase has been so tarnished by the corporate media, by people such as yourself, Jamie Kirchick, and debunkers, I have changed to calling myself an advocate for 9/11 justice. I don't consider myself a truther. I actually think that it's the corporate media and debunkers' lazy way of saying 9/11 truther. What is your definition for the phrase 9/11 truther?
Well, in my book, I identified the 9/11 truth movement as it was then defined and understood by people like me as being a subset of conspiracy movements more generally. And I had a section in the book where I defined what I thought of as a conspiracy movement. And I defined it as an intellectual movement where people have a theory of a certain historical event, and when they are greeted with adverse evidence, rather than question the nature of their conspiracy theory, instead what they do is they keep growing the conspiracy, the purported conspiracy, until it swallows all of the available evidence. So in the case of the 9/11 truth movement, as it was then called, I noticed that if I were debating someone who was part of the 9/11 truth movement, if I introduced any piece of evidence that challenged their view, I talked about court documents, or I talked about the 9/11 Commission, or I talked about media reports, they would immediately adapt their conspiracy and usually enlarge it to swallow up all of the evidence I was suggesting. So they would suggest that the 9/11 Commission members were all in on it, or the government was all in on it, or the courts are in on it, or the corporate media is in on it. And I identified that in my book as what I perceived as the defining feature of a conspiracy theory, which is that it cannot be disproved in the minds of those who hold it, because every time you introduce evidence that casts it into question, they simply just expand their list of purported conspirators. And the 9/11 truth movement is in my mind, a textbook study of that, because of the nature of their literature and the nature of their theories, and the way they kept expanding the roster of purported evildoers.
Well, I guess it's a good thing that I coined the phrase and get to decide its meaning. Like when a comet is discovered and someone gets to put their name on it.
Yeah, it's and by the way, I do agree with you that it has become sort of a term of abuse. If you call someone a truther or a 9/11 truther on social media or whatever, you're basically saying, oh, you're unhinged, or you're not part of the mainstream conversation. So strategically, I agree with your decision. Is probably a good one to use a different set of words to describe your own efforts on your website and such.
Well, a 9/11 truther has essentially become the equivalent of a baby killer or a dog torturer because of all of the hit pieces over the years from the corporate media and so on and so forth. It's actually quite disgusting in my mind.
Well, I think in recent months you've been replaced by anti-vaxxers because of the debate about vaccinations. So,
well, that's not my thing. My issue is 9/11. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what inspired you to write your book?
The reason I wrote my book was because I was interested in why people believe these things. Because as I wrote in the book, at the time I was the comment page editor at a large Canadian newspaper, and so I heard a lot on a daily basis from readers and contributors who had alternative theories about what was going on in the world. And one of the groups that sent me emails was people who were 9/11 conspiracy theorists. And what was interesting to me was a lot of these people were, they were well educated. Some of them were engineers, and some of them were, one or two of them were academics. And it was very interesting to me why these people, who were the furthest thing from, kind of unhinged losers, sitting in their basement, why they believed things that I thought were far-fetched. And I wanted to know about it. I had an intellectual curiosity in knowing why smart people believed things that I thought were so far-fetched. And I started interviewing them. But I never would have done it if I didn't start from the position of being an editor of a newspaper and getting so many emails from people who believed all this stuff. And it wasn't just 9/11. I got one guy I interviewed for my book was someone who he was a Serbian Canadian, and he didn't believe that the war in Kosovo in 1999 happened the way people said it did. He thought that a lot of the stuff was made up or contrived. And so I interviewed people like him, and I interviewed people who had conspiracy theories about Barack Obama and where he was born. So the book became a wide-ranging project about why people believe far-fetched theories, but 9/11 conspiracy theories became the central case study in my book.
Well, you understand that when you're being lied to or people refuse to answer your questions, it's human nature to theorize as to the reasons why. I mean, don't you agree?
I agree with you, certainly. Well, I agree with you on a few levels. One of them, I agree, was a complete mistake by George W. Bush and the U.S. government to wait so long to strike the 9/11 commission. It made him look like he had something to hide. He was being invasive. I think it took like more than 400 days or 440 days or something like that before he agreed to strike a 9/11 commission. And it's true. People look at that and they say, "Oh, you have something to hide."
Well,
and it's also true that our governments sometimes do lie. There's a reason that a lot of people are skeptical about their government. I don't think they lie about things as big as 9/11 because I don't think they're able to lie about things as big as 9/11. It's just it's too big and too complicated to have a coherent set of lies about. But governments do lie to people, and it's especially true in parts of the world that have autocratic governments. If you look at which people around the world are more prone to believe that their government does horrible things, it tends to be places like, say, Iran and Pakistan, where the government sometimes does do horrible things, and government conspiracies, unfortunately, are quite frequent. But it's harder in democratic countries with a free press and independent courts for governments to systematically lie to people. Well, that's one of the benefits of our society.
You mentioned that it took over 400 days to get the 9/11 commission started. It was 441 days. And that commission would not even have existed if not for the family members. Think about how scary that is. And it's not just the 9/11 commission. The Bush administration, Bush and Cheney, went to Tom Daschle in January of 2002 and asked him not to investigate the attacks at all. And this was regarding the joint congressional inquiry, which was limited in scope. It only looked at intelligence agencies and so on and so forth. And the families fought for what they thought would be an independent 9/11 commission. And it was anything but. And we can get into that a little later. But you make it sound as if we shouldn't question 9/11 at all, or if we do, that we have to have a certain belief about 9/11 before we do so. And, you say that it would be impossible to lie about 9/11. My God, after 9/11, we were told repeatedly that there were no warnings whatsoever, that this was a complete surprise, that nobody had any idea that an attack was coming, and so on and so forth. And then in May of 2002, when the August 6th PDB was leaked, which was labeled Bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S., we found out that there was a warning that talked about hijackings or other types of attacks, that talked about people photographing buildings in New York City. And that PDB, which everybody made such a big deal about, as we learned from Kurt Eichenwald, is nothing compared to the PDBs that came prior to it. PDBs that we aren't even allowed to see. So that's one lie. Another lie is the NSA said that they couldn't identify where the calls were coming from with regards to the two hijackers in San Diego, that they could only identify where the calls were going to, which was the hub in Yemen. But they were well aware of where the calls were coming from, which means that they were well aware that the hijackers were in the United States. They didn't bother telling the FBI. I mean, so that there's a multitude of lies out there. So I don't understand how you could say that it would be impossible to lie about 9/11.
What I'm saying is it's impossible for a government or any entity to create a coherent and sustained tissue of lies that purports to disguise the entire provenance of 9/11. So it is certainly true that governments will pick and choose what kind of information they release about historical episodes. And the reason they're doing it is because it's their ass covering. If you look at, for instance, the recent terrorist attack that took place in, I believe it was Tunisia, something like 6 police chiefs just lost their jobs because of what happened. When disaster strikes, people who are in power instinctively think, I'm going to get blamed because I didn't prevent this. And they start trying to manage information to make sure that the narrative that comes out doesn't make them look incompetent or stupid. This happens all the time, and I don't dispute that, and sometimes they lie about it. Like, for instance, in the 9/11 official 9/11 Commission report, the authors of the report clearly indicated that the folks from NORAD gave false information during the Commission's investigation. And in fact, the 9/11 commissioners referred the information they have to the Inspector General of NORAD. And this is, it was classic institutional behavior where you're trying to manage the information flow after a horrible disaster so you don't try not to look incompetent.
Well, what happened was they put forward a story to coincide with what people like Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney were saying about shooting down Flight 93. They were saying, trying to act heroically, that we
right.
had to make
you and I are on the same page on that, and that is what institutions do. Where you and I differ, though, is in our conception of the extent to which institutions such as government are capable of managing that narrative. I think they sort of nibble and pick at the edges, usually in a failed attempt to make themselves look good. But the thing that I found far-fetched about what was then called the 9/11 Truth Movement was that they imagined that government could create this enormous architecture of lies that presented 9/11 as being this completely different historical episode than it was.
Well,
that it originated with different people, that it originated with radically different motives, that the terrorists were stooges. You're obviously more familiar with this than me.
I'm well aware of all of the theories that exist out there. With regards to NORAD, they put forward a story to coincide with what Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney were saying. But the fact of the matter is that they did not intercept any of the planes that day. So why didn't they intercept any of the planes that day? And there are a number of questions as to why that happened. With regards to the Inspector General, do you know that during the time of the 9/11 Commission, a memo was sent to Philip Zelikow suggesting that we refer the NORAD to the Justice Department for a criminal investigation, and he sat on that memo. And then towards the end of the 9/11 Commission, they finally decided to send it to the department, or the DOD Inspector General. Do you know what the difference is between sending it to the Justice Department and the Inspector General?
Well, it's a difference between essentially an internal investigation and an external investigation.
Well, an Inspector General can only recommend that people be held accountable, whereas this Justice Department can actually hold people accountable. And with regards to the Department of Defense Inspector General, Frank Rich wrote about how the Inspector General, during the time that these investigations were taking place, like into Able Danger, like into NORAD, that they were corrupt and that they were taking orders from above. Catherine Herridge from Fox News also confirmed that the Inspector General from the DOD was corrupt. So I don't understand how you could possibly think that we even have, the slightest idea of what the truth was with regards to that day. Now, with regards to NORAD and so forth, with regards to a multitude of things. Now, have your opinions changed at all since writing your book?
Not really. In fact, just to go back a little bit to what you said, I completely agree with you that governments lie about how much they know and how they react to information. And the best example is what's happened in Argentina over the last couple of months, where you had a prosecutor in Argentina who is said to have died by suicide, but there's a controversy about how he died. Niesman was his name. And he fell into controversy there because he started investigating how the government reacted to a Hezbollah attack 2 decades ago, and the government's efforts to manage the flow of information about how they followed up on that, who they investigated, when they investigated. And that is a very real conspiracy. But again, it's an after-the-fact conspiracy. It's not a before-the-fact conspiracy. In the case of 9/11, the most sensational allegation coming out of the 9/11 Truth Commission isn't that there was any kind of after-the-fact conspiracy to manage information. That certainly did happen. It's about whether there was a before-the-fact conspiracy about actually creating this horrible tragedy for all kinds of nefarious foreign policy purposes.
Well,
and just answer your question on that score. Have I changed my mind about whether there was any kind of veracity to those 9/11 truth claims about who actually did 9/11? No, I haven't changed my mind. If anything, my views have become more concrete because, as each year goes by, as more and more politicians flow through Washington, as there are more and more opportunities for retiring public servants and retiring public politicians to come clean about things they might have done in office, you would think that the truth about such a horrible thing, if indeed there was an American conspiracy to perpetrate the crimes of 9/11, one would think that that would start coming out now. And yet the years flow by and we don't learn any new information that supports this.
That's completely, supports the idea of what? That there being an inside job?
Correct.
You make it seem like it's blasphemous to even consider the possibility of criminal complicity.
Not blasphemous, but it's highly far-fetched.
Our elected officials and people that work in government are human beings just like you and I. They are capable of greed, they're capable of jealousy, they're capable of murder, and every other horrible thing human beings are capable of. I don't put these people on pedestals. I certainly don't pray at the Church of Cheney. Now, with regards to before 9/11, when Bush first came into office, at his very first principals meeting, according to former Secretary of Treasury Paul O'Neill, it was all about finding a way to go into Iraq. It was the president saying, "Go find me a way to do this." And in a 2007 interview, Richard Clark said that there were members of the Bush administration in the months prior to 9/11 discussing creating a casus belli in order to go to war. You don't find that suspicious at all?
What I think you will find is that if you pour through the speeches and writings of Henry Kissinger, who is often quoted by 9/11 conspiracy theorists, you find all sorts of things that you look at that sentence, or you look at that phrase as, my God, that's exactly what someone would say if they were plotting to invade Iraq or invade Afghanistan or whatnot. It's true that out of the reams of information these things have said, there are always going to be slogans that they've said that you say, oh, that fits into my theory exactly.
Well, it's not. It doesn't fit into any. First of all, I have no idea what happened on 9/11 or who was ultimately responsible, but I know suspicious behavior when I see it. And, Dick Cheney, before 9/11, was meeting with every head of every oil company in existence, even though they denied it before Congress, and Judicial Watch managed to get documentation to show that they were looking over Iraq's oil fields prior to 9/11.
But so let's stop you there on that. Okay, let's say the theory was that they were looking over Iraq's oil fields. So then they invade Iraq. It's $1 trillion operation.
But it wasn't.
And then they don't even take the oil. Like, this whole theory falls apart after the invasion of Iraq, because the theory would suggest that they'd invade Iraq and they'd steal Iraq's oil. Instead, you look at Iraq, it's being run by French and Russian oil companies.
Not every criminal.
The theory makes no sense.
Not every criminal manages to get away with their crime.
But then what's the theory here? That they invaded Iraq, they did all the dirty work, lost thousands of lives, and then they forgot to take the oil? Like, it makes no sense to me.
They didn't forget to take the oil. There are plenty of American companies that have benefited from the oil in Iraq, along with Russia, along with China, and so on and so forth.
But oil's at like $50 a barrel. Where's all this money coming in? In fact, the oil. I was listening to NPR this morning, and they were saying that there's so much oil being pumped in the United States itself, and the price of oil is now so low that you actually have storage facilities in Cushing, Oklahoma, that are actually running out of space for all the surplus oil, which is terrible business, by the way, for the oil companies.
There were several reports that said that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. colluded to lower oil prices in an effort to bankrupt Russia. And these aren't figments of my imagination. These are reports from The Guardian, I think Reuters, and so on and so forth.
All right. You can see why someone who was listening to a theory about how Iraq was a smash and grab operation to steal oil.
But see, many people have said that it was about oil. I think the guy who was the former head of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, even said it was about oil.
I think what responsible people have said, and what I would agree, is that the United States and other countries were especially concerned about Saddam Hussein and especially concerned about that region because tin pot dictators in that region have an outsized effect on world events because of their ability to manipulate huge quantities of oil. That is true. I agree with it. In that sense, the Iraq War could, in the abstract, said to be about oil because we don't care as much what happens in less strategic places, like, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, because they don't monopolize one particular globally essential asset just as oil. So a lot of the rhetoric I hear from people saying, oh, this war was about oil because such and such a statesman said it or such and such a military official said it, usually it's a reference to the fact that oil is abundant in the Middle East, and therefore the Middle East is an extremely strategic part of the world. And in that respect, I agree with you. It doesn't mean that Iraq war was a smash and grab operation to steal oil.
First of all, it wasn't just about oil. It was about making billions of dollars. It was about projecting America's hegemony across the world. You know, it's not just about oil. But again, as I said, not all criminals manage to get away with their crimes.
Okay, fair
so
enough.
let me get to the next question. Do you consider journalists like Robert Scheer, who wrote an article for the LA Times called "What We Don't Know About 9/11 Hurts Us," or Benjamin DeMott, who wrote an article for Harper's Magazine called "Whitewash as Public Service: How the 9/11 Commission Report Defrauds the Nation," as 9/11 truthers or conspiracy theorists?
I'm going to plead ignorance here. I have to say I have not heard of either of those two authors or the articles in question.
Well, okay, but any journalist that has ever questioned 9/11, which are very few, by the way, but you know there have been reports. Do you consider them to be 9/11 truthers or conspiracy theorists?
Look, what I have seen is here in Canada, there's been a couple of respectable journalists who have dabbled in what I consider to be 9/11 conspiracism. Barry Zwicker is an example. I'm sure you're aware of his work. He used to work at a big newspaper here called the Globe and Mail, and he became a truther. You know what sometimes happens is these people they are, you know, Barry Zwicker, you could look him up. He's written thousands of articles for respected Canadian publications. And then sometimes they sort of lose the plot a little bit later in life, and they kind of go into some crazy directions. And in his case, it was 9/11 conspiracism. Some of these, I know a guy who worked at the National Post here in Canada, and he started writing a lot about stuff about how vaccines were going to kill you and stuff. And it happens. I mean, people kind of sometimes.
But I'm not going to defend Barry Zwicker. I'm not into theories so much as I am promoting information, asking questions, promoting lies, and so on and so forth. But, I mean, geez, there was a little girl out in the hallway screaming. I just, you know, where's the line drawn? And, you know, in what...
No, but that's a good question. Let me step back, because I don't want to leave that question hanging. To me, the line is drawn. I'm going to go back to something I said earlier in the interview. I'm willing to pursue any avenue of inquiry. And when you talk to 9/11 theorists, they always say, I'm just asking questions, I'm just using the empirical method, I'm just being scientific. And I respect that. As I've admitted earlier in this interview, governments do lie. They do it for their ass-covering purposes. It's common. And it's especially important for journalists to ask questions. For me, the line is when something becomes a conspiracy theory is when it's clear that the person offering the alternative theory is locked in their own dogma, and they're dismissing any evidence to the contrary, which is, say, any evidence that backs up the officially promoted theory, and that they keep enlarging their conspiracy theory and enlarging their mandate to, quote, ask questions.
One thing
every time a contrary authority is raised.
Do you understand that the 9/11 family members they submitted hundreds of well-researched questions to the 9/11 Commission to answer. They only answered 30% of their questions.
Okay, but let me step back from that a little bit. I agree with you that from a moral point of view, it is extremely important to address concerns from survivors.
It's not just about survivors. I mean, there are a multitude of questions. There are many things that the 9/11 Commission either omitted from its report or, you know, distorted and so on and so forth. I mean, the mandate of the 9/11 Commission was to give a, quote, full and complete accounting of the 9/11 attacks. And every whistleblower that they didn't speak to or every avenue that they didn't look into, it just shows that they failed in their mandate. And, you know, there's a multitude of problems with the 9/11 Commission. But
one thing I found as a journalist is that there is, as human beings, there's a tendency to assign great moral value to the questions asked and the testimony and the beliefs of people who are directly affected by tragedies. So if it's EMS first responders or family members of victims or injured victims themselves who step forward, and that we do have a tendency to assign them a lot of moral credibility. Unfortunately, what you do find as a journalist is sometimes these are the people who are actually the most least informed. And one example, for instance, is the false movement to link vaccines to autism. Well, some of the biggest proponents of that theory are parents who have autistic kids. And one of the reasons these false theories about vaccines and autism have been promulgated in the media is because reporters want to believe the parents. They think it's morally important to believe the testimonials of the parents of autistic kids. But those are often the people who are the least informed because they're so upset by the situation, because they're so personally affected. They latch on to nonsensical theories. So in some cases, sadly, this is a sad thing to say, they're actually the last people we should be listening to. Because sometimes they're the most emotionally vested in the answer to the questions.
You couldn't be more wrong. Let me. Do you know who the September 11th advocates are?
They used to be called, the term, I forget, it was a group of women who were especially prominent, and I forget the name that the media gave them.
They were referred to as the Jersey Girls, and it was it was 9/11 family member Sally Regenhard that actually called them that. I want the audience to know who these women are. They are 4 widows who lost their husbands on 9/11. They are essentially responsible for the creation of the 9/11 Commission. They were part of the 9/11 Family Steering Committee. They worked with the staffers of the 9/11 Commission. They provided hundreds of well-researched questions for the 9/11 Commission to answer. They attended every public hearing of the 9/11 Commission. And before and during the 9/11 Commission, they were in the media a lot. They were part of the process from the very beginning. I want you and people to understand that these aren't just any 9/11 family members. They went through hell and know what they're talking about, or at the very least should be listened to. So for you to say that they're the last people we should be listening to, I think that's absolutely absurd. And incidentally, I heard you say that 9/11 truthers or advocates for 9/11 justice started appearing after it was found that there were no WMD in Iraq. Do you know that the family members are actually technically the first members of the 9/11 truth movement? Do you understand that? Do you realize that?
I can see how that, based on how you define the term, that would make sense.
Okay, well, all right. My next question, is it fair to say that you consider yourself to be a neoconservative?
I don't think, I've actually, I don't consider myself a neoconservative. This may surprise you, I've actually kind of moved away from the right wing of the political spectrum in the last few years, in part because I'm so disappointed in how the Iraq War did turn out. I mean, it is true that the Iraq War ended up being a really bad idea. I've admitted this in my journalism. I admit also to being a columnist here in Canada who thought otherwise. I thought the Iraq War would end up very differently. And foreign policy adventurism has had very mixed results over the last 10 or 15 years. So I'm someone who has changed his mind about a lot of things.
Well, I saw that you've written for papers like the Weekly Standard and belong to an organization called the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which has James Woolsey as the chairman and includes people like Michael Ledeen. So you're saying that you don't like being lumped into a category of people simply because you may agree with some of what they say?
Let me put it this way:
because I can relate to that.
If anyone's, like, for instance, the logical extension of the neocon thesis would be that we should start bombing Iran and that we should perhaps even consider invading Iran to halt their nuclear program. But I think that would be a terrible idea. And in truth, I actually don't know. I know very few American conservatives, even people who write for Commentary magazine, who would agree with that thesis. I think neoconservatism, although it's still used as a term of abuse in American political circles, I think the neoconservative movement was as we knew it, was essentially killed off by the failure of the Iraq War to meet the expectations of its loudest cheerleaders.
I think they still exist. I think PNAC closed its doors, and now they started this new organization. I think it's called FPI, or the acronym is FPI. So they're still out there. Ray McGovern, who was a CIA analyst for 27 years, called them the crazies. And when they came back into office after Bush was quote-unquote elected president, he said, the crazies are back.
Look, there are always going to be people who have a really ambitious view of what American military power can accomplish. However, I think the ranks of those people have been vastly diminished because of what happened in Iraq. And not just Iraq, also Afghan, also Libya. Let's not forget Libya, which America had a relatively modest role in compared to its role in Afghanistan and Iraq. And look how that turned out. Libya is a mess. So I think, anyone who back in 2002 would say, we should start bombing this country, we'll take it over, we'll turn it into a democracy, what could go wrong? In 2002, 2003, people still took that view seriously. Now very few people take that seriously, and that's what's killed neoconservatism.
All right. Why do people who write hit pieces against those who are advocating for 9/11 justice lump in crazy things like UFOs, the Illuminati, reptiles, and such? I'm an advocate for 9/11 justice. I don't advocate for that crazy bullshit. And I know many others who don't either. So
the reason for this is that for whatever reason, some of the people who have been the most vocal proponents of the 9/11 truth movement have been people who believe in all sorts of other bizarre things.
Well,
and the example I give in my book is this fellow Icky in Britain. His first name escapes me now. He's the one whose thesis involves human beings being ruled over by lizard people. I can actually look up his first name on the internet. David Icky is his name.
I'm well familiar with who he is. I've never promoted him. I've never supported him. And the same goes for Alex Jones. I tried to be a team player at one time, but I found out that he was just a member of what I call the conspiracy theory industry. And I want nothing to do with him, and he does not speak for me. And neither do people like David Icke. So I don't think it's fair that writers like you lump in all these crazy sounding things. It's crazy by association is what it is.
Okay, but it's not that. Look, when I would go to campus events and I'd see people campaigning for 9/11 truth, they'd be wearing Alex Jones T-shirts.
Oh, I understand. He has a lot of power.
It's not without basis that that journalists like me would therefore say these people who want 9/11 truth, many of them are followers of Alex Jones, or many of them are followers of David Icke, or whatever. Like if you ask these people who, how did you learn this information? Many will say, I heard about it on InfoWars.
Well, do you know that a lot of people who got turned on to places like InfoWars, they first started questioning 9/11 by themselves, and then they came across people like Alex Jones and started to listen to what he said. And they were well-intentioned, well-meaning people who took bad information and started promoting it. And, it's like, unfortunately, he had a lot of pull. He essentially helped to co-opt what I consider to be the 9/11 truth movement. Our signs used to say, support the 9/11 family members, expose the 9/11 cover-up. And then they started to say New World Order, or, false flag attack. And that came where 9/11 was an inside job, which is a phrase I can't stand. And, that was because of people like Alex Jones. So it's unfair, I think. You're essentially what you're doing is you're taking a few bad apples out of the cart and then throwing away the rest of the cart, saying that they're all bad apples as well.
Look, if you're part of an ideological movement, you can't control who the major players in that movement are going to be. It's kind of like saying, look,
you actually can when the corporate media, there's a multitude of people out there that could have been spoken to but were not, like Paul Thompson, the creator of the complete 9/11 timeline. He was never on Fox News. They chose people like Jim Fetzer and Webster Tarpley and Alex Jones and David Von Kleist. and all of the people who were willing to promote their theories about what happened that day. They did
well,
not.
Webster Tarpley is a good example. I mean, I went to Washington to do a speaking event, and Webster Tarpley was the guy I was debating, and I was shocked how many people showed up to hear Webster Tarpley speak. He has a huge following, so it's not surprising the media is going to say these guys have large followings within what you call the conspiracy industry. So these are people who are mainstream advocates of this kind of conspiracy, mainstream in quotes, I guess.
Most people in the 9/11 truth movement started to see through Webster Tarpley's bullshit over the years. And as a matter of fact, there's something called the Kennebunkport warning that you could look up if you want. And essentially, he called Cindy Sheehan a name, and I defended her against him. And as a result of me defending her and so on and so forth, he went on a stage in New York City during an anniversary event and inferred that I was part of COINTELPRO. So Webster Tarpley is not someone that should be taken seriously. Okay? Now, why do writers like you and others find it necessary to try and discredit the messenger by name-calling and assigning psychological profiling diagnoses instead of taking the time to answer the actual questions or to see if the questions were ever honestly answered?
Well, look, in my case, for people who read my book, they'll see that in my chapter on the personality types of people who did become heavily vested in the 9/11 truth movement, I was careful to say, look, these people fall into different types. And I actually said in my book that a very small percentage of the people I interviewed were clinically insane. Most of them were quite sane, and there were people who had profound feelings of distrust toward the society around them. That tended to be the unifying characteristic of all the people I spoke to. And there, I broke them up into subsets. Some of them were sort of militant campus revolutionary types. Others were sort of middle-aged intellectuals who latched on to 9/11 truth because they loved puzzle solving and they liked the sort of the complexity of it, and they loved immersing themselves in the research. And there were others who were, more mystically minded. David Icke falls into that category, I would argue, and who see the geopolitical world around us as sort of a smokescreen on some larger truth that lies behind it, but they see it in mystical terms. So I went into this whole typology, but as I say, as I made clear in the book, I didn't find these people to be clinically nuts. What I was trying to do was discover why sane, smart people believe stuff that I find is far-fetched. And I believe in my book I didn't engage in name-calling.
You've called several people cranks. In fact, I looked up the word. It showed up 35 times in your book. So
the word crank, when you look at someone who's a crank, when we use the term colloquially, someone, you see them and they start talking about how we'd all be driving around in flying planes if the U.S., oil industry didn't kill off the flying plane, or they have theories about AIDS, or they have theory about the banking system with the global money supply, or about Jews, or about who really wrote Shakespeare's plays. We all know what a crank is. A crank is someone who has a weird theory about everything. And these people, if they have a weird theory about A, you can usually predict that they're going to have a weird theory about B, C, and D. And we all know the type. It's a word that's accessible to my readers, which is why I used it in the book. I didn't mean it to be like a term of epic abuse. I was just trying to tap into the concept of what we know of as a crank. They're people who exist, and that was the label I put on.
Okay, well, that's the modus operandi of everyone who's ever written a hit piece, is that they love to call us names, suggest that we're crazy. I've seen people like Glenn Beck try to say that someone who took a few shots in the Holocaust Museum, who murdered someone, was a hero of the 9/11 truth movement, trying to paint us all as murderers. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. And with regards to this psychological need, do you think I want to be doing this? I mean, do you think I wanted to spend the last 13 years of my life dealing with an aggressive corporate media, aggressive debunkers, aggressive members of the 9/11 truth movement, crank phone calls, death threats? I was spied on by a company called ITRR. Watching 9/11 first responders become sick and die, listening to 9/11 family members cry because they want real truth, accountability, and justice. I mean, that's absolutely absurd. I believed everything my government and the TV was telling me. It was their actions and their lies that made me try to do the right thing. So I don't know, maybe you're right. Maybe I have a psychological need to do the right thing.
Look, I've never met you. I couldn't say why you're drawn to this movement. I enjoy talking to you, but my book is about the people, primarily about the people that I met. I guess the reason you're doing this is right now known only unto yourself. I'm not going to try and psychoanalyze you over the phone.
It's the right thing to do. We were lied to about a multitude of things. Most investigations we had its own version of compromise and corruption. And I can't understand, in what world does it make sense not to seek truth, accountability, and justice for the murder of 2,976 people, especially knowing that we were lied to about that day, and especially considering what that day has been used for. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand the thinking behind that. And in the beginning of your book, you say that you're not going to debunk every theory, and instead you pointed to things like Popular Mechanics' book and the blog Screw Loose Change. Popular Mechanics does not talk about things like whistleblowers or the lies of the NSA or CIA or Saudi Arabia or Philip Zelikow, the 9/11 Commission, a multitude of other things. And as for Screw Loose Change, did you know that at one time one of their star posters was someone by the name of Troy Sexton, who liked to crank call activists such as myself and family members to harass them, record the conversations, and post them online for everyone to hear? I mean, come on, really? Is that the best you could have pointed to?
I pointed to a lot of sources in my book.
I understand that
website was actually, I found it was a clever way to use the conspiracy theorists' own media tools against them. That's what I found interesting about it.
Well, they're a bunch of assholes, is what they are.
All right.
And they really don't deserve any attention whatsoever. All right, my next question. At one time, supporting the 9/11 family members was considered the thing to do. In your book, you essentially infer that we use 9/11 family members because, quote, damaged survivors are particularly effective as recruiters for conspiracist movements because the spectacle of their grief short-circuits our intellectual faculties, much the same way that graphic testimony from a crime victim can sway a jury to convict an innocent defendant, end quote. Now, first of all, I don't appreciate the inference. If you want truth, accountability, and justice for the 9/11 attacks, working alongside 9/11 family members seeking the same is only natural, and I might add the right thing to do. Secondly, I came into this all on my own. No author, movie, or family member brought me into this cause. I saw that we were being lied to, and I tried to do something about it. Now, do you or do you not think we should be supporting 9/11 family members seeking truth, accountability, and justice?
I think everybody supports truth, accountability, and justice, but I don't think that theories advanced by a lot of people in this field have any credibility because they've been investigated. It's now been the passage of 14 years. There's no additional evidence that any of these theories that we were lied to on a massive scale about the true origins of 9/11, they don't hold water. And the fact that someone is related to someone who was tragically killed on September 11th, 2001, that doesn't give them any kind of magical insight into why that event occurred. In fact, as I've discussed before, sometimes it makes them less insightful about the true origins of that event because they're psychologically wounded by the event, and so they become more vulnerable to far-fetched theories about what might have caused that event. It happens all that you see it with examples I've given you. It happens with wars. It happens with the origins of autism. It happens with people, who get AIDS, and sometimes they latch onto bizarre theories about how AIDS is propagated. It's the human mind becomes more vulnerable when it's investigating the causes of its own misery.
Okay, the true origins, according to the official account in the 9/11 report, says that there were no state sponsors for the 9/11 attacks. And yet we have found and heard over and over again that specific Saudis that are linked to the government helped to finance the attacks. But the 9/11 report absolved the government of Saudi Arabia. And in fact, they absolved people like Princess Haifa, Osama Baznan, and so on and so forth. And so there you go right there.
Actually, I'm on the same side with you about the Saudi stuff, because apparently there's all kinds of information in the 9/11 report about the Saudi government and Saudi nationals, which was essentially blacked out, right?
Well,
and we haven't seen it yet. I'd love to see that information.
Do you know why it was blacked out? Because people like Philip Zelikow blocked half of the Saudi interview requests. He fired someone by the name of Dana Lieseman, who was on the Joint Congressional Inquiry, who helped to author the 28 redacted pages of the Joint Congressional Inquiry. He blocked her access to those 28 redacted pages when she was trying to do her job. And so she went through a back channel to get them, and as a result, he fired her. Dieter Snell and Philip Zelikow took part in a, quote, late-night editing session to remove Saudi support from the 9/11 report and move the information into footnotes in the back of the book against the wishes of the staffers who worked on the 9/11 Commission. So that instance alone, how could you trust the 9/11 report? My God, they had government minders who were intimidating witnesses. I mean, the families released 3 statements during the time of the 9/11 Commission that said that there should not be any government minders whatsoever. Now think about what I just said. They were intimidating witnesses. So how could you ever come to the conclusion that the 9/11 report is the end-all, be-all, the definitive account of 9/11? It's absurd to me.
You know, no report commissioned by the government, I agree with you on this, is ever going to be truly 100% objective, because at the end of the day, it's being commissioned and paid for by the government. So it's never going to be 100% independent. But when I read that report, and I guess it was, 5 years ago that I read the report, whatever it was, 6 years ago, I remember cross-checking with what I knew, with the evidence that was cited, with the sources that were cited, and it read reasonably to me. I also like the fact that the report knocks Democrats and Republicans alike. No one can read that report and say, "Oh, this was written by a bunch of Republican stooges." It's not written that way. And subsequent books, there was a book written by Thomas Keane about sort of what it was like during the 9/11 Commission. There have been numerous journalistic inquiries into the functioning of that commission. They have identified 1 or 2 problems, and you've talked about problems, but by and large, it was a credible and well-respected commission exercise. And by the way, the results of the 9/11 Commission report have largely stood up. I would like to see more information about the Saudi connection, but by and large, it's not as if the results in that report have been massively discredited since it was published.
Yeah, but how could they didn't do their job? And the families, when they fought for the 9/11 Commission, they expected that people would be held accountable. We're talking about, people who lied or organizations that lied. Don't you think that people should have been held accountable for that?
Well, as I say, everybody loves the theory of accountability and transparency, as do I, but I think your questioning about accountability and transparency starts from the premise that some horrible overarching fiction was being promoted by the 9/11 Commission, and on that thing you and I just fundamentally disagree. I don't think that was the case.
It starts on the premise that they lied and that people need to be held accountable. I think Thomas Keane said that at one time, that if he were in a position of power, there are people in government that would no longer be in their jobs.
You know what? Actually, on that point, I agree too. The CIA director, he didn't lose his job. It's true. You and I agree on that there were massive intelligence failures. This happened after Katrina. George Bush flies in and says that the director of FEMA did a bang-up job. This is kind of what governments do. They often the dishonesty expresses itself through cynical reactions to government failures. People cover their asses and they congratulate themselves for their performance, even if their performance was essentially a failure, as it was in this case, because they failed to prevent 9/11.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think that elements within our government are capable of hurting Americans?
I think that there are elements within the U.S. government that are remarkably indifferent to the suffering of certain classes of Americans. For instance, American prisoners. For instance, Americans in some poor communities. I think that people in the lower classes, people who are mentally ill, people who are prisoners in America, people have very little constituency in the media or in politics. They often get the shaft in the United States because there's no repercussions for victimizing them.
How about the heroes of 9/11? Do you think that they would hurt them.
One thing that you have seen is, at least for a while, you saw an indifference to the medical conditions that resulted from their activities on 9/11, breathing in all sorts of toxic chemicals. That part of, you talk about the 9/11 truth movement, that part, there is some resonance for me.
Wow.
That you had people working in extremely dangerous and toxic environments during the after
They
effects
were
of
lied
that tragedy, and some of them really did get very sick.
They were lied to about the air and water quality down there in an effort to open Wall Street. This is well documented, and as a result, thousands of 9/11 first responders have gotten sick. Well over 1,000 have died. No one was held accountable for these lies, and these lies were directed by the White House. So the idea that elements within our government would never hurt Americans is absurd. I mean, look at how many soldiers were they willing to send to war to their deaths? How many chemical weapons did they use which caused our soldiers to get sick? I don't think they give a shit about Americans. Or,
well, that's a pretty broad statement. I mean, in general, I wouldn't go that far. I do think sometimes, as I say, governments are indifferent to the suffering of some disenfranchised communities. But broadly, I don't think it's true that governments don't care about the citizenry in general.
Well, our government does not work for the people. It works for the corporate interests, and this is well documented. I think the support for Congress right now is at its lowest it's ever been. Now, my next question, are you familiar with groups like 9/11 Citizens Watch or History Commons?
History Commons, yes, I've seen that. I mean, some of these are sources that I investigated when I was doing my book, but as you know, my book was published in 2011, so I'm not state-of-the-art when it comes to some of the sources you're talking about.
9/11 Citizens Watch was a citizens watchdog group formed by the late John Judge and Kyle Hentz to make sure the 9/11 Commission was doing its job. They worked with the 9/11 Family Steering Committee as best as they could. History Commons is the current site that houses the complete 9/11 timeline that was started by Paul Thompson. And I didn't know if you'd heard of them because they weren't mentioned in your book. And these are things that are essential, or an essential part of the history and tools of the 9/11 truth movement. And you completely overlooked them. How is that possible?
It's a big movement, or at least it was at the time. There were thousands of potential people to look towards. Some people consented to interviews, some people didn't consent to interviews. I tended to prioritize people who gave me interviews, or whose documentation that I could find on the internet was particularly interesting or original. There were some fairly minor figures in the 9/11 Truth Movement that figured prominently in my book because they were extremely forthcoming in interviews and said interesting things.
Well,
that's the way it is with any writing exercise. You have to pick and choose the sources you use.
All right. Since we're on the subject of what was and wasn't mentioned in your book, I did a little counting, and you have Alex Jones mentioned 16 times, David Ray Griffin 15 times, Webster Tarpley 14 times, Richard Gage 11 times, Robert Balsamo 8 times, Kevin Barrett 6 times, Eric Huffschmid 4 times, Thierry Masson 2 times, and so on and so forth. And then you have Paul Thompson 0, Kevin Fenton 0, Ray Novoselsky 0, Jenna Orkin 0, John Judge 0, Peter Lance 0, Phil Sheenan 0, James Ridgway 0, Eric Larson 0, James Dorman 0. And you know what the difference is between those people you covered the most and those you didn't?
What is that?
Well, the first bunch likes to focus on promoting things like controlled demolition or a missile hitting the Pentagon. The second bunch does its best to promote solid information and ask good questions. And so I can't believe that so many important people like Paul Thompson and John Judge. My God, they were
well,
foundational.
Michael Rupert was also extremely prominent in my book, and he's not someone who believes in crazy missiles or UFOs or anything like that. He was a guy who was just asking. I went all the way to California and by the way, Richard Gage himself doesn't have any crazy theories about 9/11. He's all about the engineering and asking questions, and he is by no means someone who is considered marginal to 9/11 truth movement. And Richard Gage, if you ask him what happened 9/11, he's like extremely careful. He said, "Oh, I don't know. I'm just asking questions. I want a citizen's inquiry." So I don't think you can credibly accuse me of simply going for the people who are the most extreme in their views.
Well, it certainly seemed that way. Now, why did you reference Loose Change and not 9/11 Press for Truth?
The reason unfortunately, we've been at this for an hour, so I might have to go back to work soon. But let me address that question because I think it's important. The reason I addressed Loose Change is because so many of the people who I interviewed, especially young people, when I said, how did you get into this movement? They said, I got into it because I was surfing late at night the internet, and I came across this film, Loose Change, and it was so well produced, and it was so persuasive, and that's what made me get onto the 9/11 Truth movement. So many people said that. I said, obviously, this Loose Change film is an important phenomenon. That's why I featured it in my book.
The reason that Loose Change was so prominent was because that was the movie that the corporate media chose to focus on, to give attention to paint as kind of like our holy grail, like everybody in the 9/11 Truth movement believes everything that's within Loose Change, and that's simply not the truth. And don't feel too bad about not covering 9/11 Press for Truth or its sequel, which is, in their own words, the untold stories of the 9/11 families. The corporate media completely ignored them as well. However, every movie critic that was willing to review 9/11 Press for Truth gave it a good review. So imagine that.
All
right, so we've been doing this for an hour. Let me see if there are any questions. Have you read the different press releases from the Jersey Girls over the years that call into question different things about 9/11?
I did read at least some of their material when I was doing the book back in 2009, 2010. I can't say that as I've already admitted, I can't say that I've kept up with this field since the publication of my book 4 years ago.
All right. Did you read the report compiled by 9/11 family members Lori Van Auken and Mindy Kleinberg that shows how poorly the 9/11 Commission answered their questions?
I can't remember if I read that document, but I do know that there are relatives of 9/11 victims who are concerned about what was and what wasn't covered in the 9/11 Commission report.
All right. Are you aware that on September 11th, 2006, 9/11 family members got together at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. to call for a new investigation into 9/11, that in February 2008, the Jersey Girls called for a new investigation, and that in 2009, over 100 9/11 family members supported our effort to get a new investigation into 9/11 onto the ballot of New York City?
I'm aware that for these people, 9/11 was tragically a defining element in their life, and I'm sure in many cases to their dying day they will insist on new investigations and push for alternative theories behind what happened. This is what happened when people are traumatized by horrible events. They never, understandably, they never lose their hunger for trying to get new information about these horrible events.
Why do you say that they're pushing, theories instead of asking questions? Why seeking accountability? Why do you have to say they're promoting theories instead of those things?
In the 9/11 Truth movement, what I found is that everybody just says, "Oh, I'm asking questions, I'm asking questions, I'm asking questions." But when you talk to them, the reason they're asking questions is because they have some alternative theory behind what happened on 9/11, and if you push them further, they will admit to you, well, I suspect that it was an inside job.
Well,
and they don't want to say that because it sounds crazy, and in my mind it is kind of crazy. So instead what they said is, I'm demanding transparency, I'm demanding accountability. But these are fancy words to say, I think 9/11 was an inside job, and I'm looking for information to prove that. That's essentially what you find when you're talking to these people.
I look at 9/11 as a crime, not an act of war. And as with every crime, there are suspects for that crime. And I think that along with people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, elements within our government and other governments like Saudi Arabia, like Pakistan, have more than earned the title of suspect for the crime of 9/11.
Fair enough. Okay.
And, I'm not trying to prove that, but I certainly don't discount it. I don't think that it's impossible.
What you just said, to my mind, is the most reasonable articulation of the 9/11 truth thesis. But as I say, most people I interviewed, they don't stop there. They will go and they will say,
Well, then I think you need to start talking to a lot more people like Paul Thompson, people like Dr. Nafiz Ahmed, people like Ray Novoselsky or John Duffy or Rory O'Connor or Eric Larson or James Dorman. I mean, there's a whole number of people you could have spoken to that come across a lot more credibly than the individuals you
Well, look, now for the last hour, and now I've spoken to you. So presumably,
Okay.
you would put yourself amongst that group. So I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I did learn some things, and thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Well, would you like to apologize for misrepresenting advocacy for 9/11 justice?
No, I'm not going to apologize. I didn't say terrible things about these people. And in fact, in some cases, the Wall Street Journal made a point in their review of my book. The Wall Street Journal made a point of saying, hey, this guy Jonathan Kay actually painted a sympathetic picture of a lot of these people. So I don't think I have to apologize.
I think you misrepresented it. I think you owe an apology to the family members who have been seeking truth, accountability, and justice. That's my personal opinion, but if you don't want to apologize, that's fine.
Fair enough.
Is there anything that you would like to promote at this time?
No, just to say thanks very much for the opportunity. If anybody wants to direct criticism or helpful links, I'm on Twitter. I'm at John Kay, JONKAY. And, if people are listening to this point, it's been more than an hour. Thank you for dedicating your time to listening to me and John Gould talk about this. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, John, for taking the time today.
Take care.
All right, bye-bye.